Hi, I'm Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting. Have you ever made half square triangles only to find out that some of them come up short, throwing off your points or making it really difficult to create an accurate quilt block? There are so many methods out there for making these half square triangles. There's special rulers, specialty papers, and tutorial after tutorial promising you the perfect half square triangle. Believe me, I have tried them all, and I'm here to tell you what I've learned and what I do to create half square triangles that turn out right every single time. So today I'm going to show you exactly how to prevent common mistakes and share tried and true techniques to help you get the perfect half square triangle every single time. So let's get started. I'm going to use this block. It's called Broken Dishes, and it's made up of 4 large half square triangles. So this is a real easy block for me to demonstrate the technique and what we are looking for, how we can troubleshoot any difficulties we might have in creating the half square triangles that go into any block. So the first tip is to cut your fabric a tiny bit bigger than what you need. Whether you're making 2 half square triangles at a time, 4 at a time, or even 8 at a time, if you add a tiny bit of extra to the 2 starter squares and then trim them back, you will increase the chances of creating perfectly accurate half square triangles. So I'm just going to show you, back in the day when we made half square triangles, most quilters used a no trim method, and that's what this one is. And actually what you do is you take the finished size of your half square triangle. This is a 3.5 inch unfinished, so it would be a 3 inch finished, and you add 7/8 of an inch to that and cut your squares that size. So since I want this to be 3 inch finished, I add 7/8, and I have cut 2 squares 3 7/8 inches. Then what I do is I draw a diagonal line from corner to corner, and I'll show you that. I have my 2 pieces right sides together, and I'm just going to take and draw that diagonal line corner to corner, and then I'm going to move my ruler, line up my 1/4 inch marking on that drawn line, and draw another line, flip it around, and draw the line again. Now this is common. We do this all the time when we are creating half square triangles. What is not common is that 7/8 inch size, because it's really difficult to get everything lined up right. So what you would do on this, you would sew on this line, sew on this line, and you would cut apart on that center line, giving you these 2 half square triangles, which I have pressed toward the dark. Now, supposedly, using that 3 7/8 inch square to start with, actually 2 squares, this should turn out 3.5 inches. So let's see if it does. And there should be no trimming. That's the other thing. So we line up our diagonal line. My ruler is a 3.5 inch ruler, and you can see it's pretty close. But if you look down here, we do have a gap. We have a gap here, and that means it's not quite right. And I worked really hard to make sure that this was accurate. Here's the second one that we got. Remember, we cut it in half so we would get 2. And if I look at this one looks pretty good on, well, this one's got a little gap here and a little gap here. We would trim off those dog ears, but once again, they are not exactly right, and we have absolutely no wiggle room here. It had to come out perfect or it would not be correct. So that is the old school method. Now, in this method, rather than adding 7/8 of an inch to that 3 inch finished size, we add a whole inch. So if you have a 3 inch finished, you add an inch, you cut your squares 4. If you want it to be 2 inch finished, you would add an inch, cut your squares 3 inches, and so on. So this one, since I wanted it to be 3.5 inches unfinished or 3 inch finished, I cut my squares 1 inch larger, both of them, and I put them right sides together. So I have 2 4 inch squares, sewed them, marked them the same way I showed you before. I marked a corner to corner line. I marked a line on each side a 1/4 inch away from that diagonal corner to corner line, and now I sewed on those two lines. Now I'm going to cut them apart on the diagonal line. That's my cutting line. And let's see what we end up with. So I have two squares, two half square triangles that I'm going to press toward the dark. And there I have them pressed. Now let's measure. Remember, they need to be a finished size of 3.5 inches. So when I take my 3.5 inch ruler and I put it on here, I have a little bit of extra on all edges. You can see all the way around. I can trim this up to an exact 3.5 inch unfinished size. That's what we want. This does take a little bit of extra time, as you can see, when you cut it a tiny bit larger, but you have a perfect sized square or half square triangle when you are done. And that's what's most important. If we have to take a little extra time, I think it's worth it in order to trim back and get that accurate size. And the same thing on this one. This is the second one. And if you look again, we have just a teeny bit extra all the way around the edge. That is going to give us that perfect square. So that's point number one. Cut your starting squares a teeny bit larger, 1 inch larger than the finished size of your half square triangle. So the next thing is number two, mark precise diagonal lines. When we mark that diagonal line, the original one corner to corner is our cutting line, and then the two on each side of that corner to corner line is our sewing line. We want them to be precise. One way that you can do that is you can, first of all, position your points on your square using a line on your cutting mat. That just gives you a little extra double check. So when I line up my ruler then right here in order to mark my lines, I've got a check here, and then those 2 points are also a check. This is the 2 at a time method. Now there's all sorts of methods. There's 4 at a time, 8 at a time. We're going to talk about 2 at a time. No matter which method you're using, you want to make sure that you have marked precise lines. Even if you're just a tiny bit off, or if you're in a hurry and you don't mark corner to corner, or maybe your ruler is just off just a teeny bit, that's going to result in one of these sides being larger and one side being smaller than the other one, and it can result in a problem when it comes to the finished size of your triangle. Now, I like to either use a 0.7 millimeter mechanical pencils, just a plain pencil that I get in the office supply section of the store, or my favorite is my Sew Line pencil. Now, this one actually has 3 colors in it, so depending on what fabric I'm using, it has a black tip, it has a pink tip, and it has a white tip. You can also buy green or red. And again, depending on your fabric, what I like about this is it is a ceramic lead, so it doesn't break. I do have a little trouble with these sometimes when you're marking on fabric. The tip can break. It's not a big deal, but I really like these. So when I am marking, I want to make sure that I use a pencil that has a fine tip. If you use one of the wide markers, maybe you decide to use an erasable marker. If you look at it, you've got a pretty good sized tip here, and that can also affect that sewing line. So if I am going to mark this, I'm going to mark my corner to corner first, just using my mechanical pencil. I start from the middle and I work out, because if you start here, sometimes you can scrunch in your fabric if you're not careful. So that's my first line. Now I'm going to move to this to show you this one. When I place this line, this 1/4 inch line of my ruler, I'm not going to put it directly on top of the corner to corner line. I'm going to put it just to the left so that my 1/4 inch marking is here, and you can see my pencil line underneath. That's going to give me a teeny bit smaller seam allowance, but it's okay. It's going to give me a little extra here for trimming. I'm going to use the black lead, and it has that ceramic tip, so it just glides right on my fabric, which I really like. Same thing when I flip it around and do the other sewing line. Again, we're doing 2 at a time. I can see my corner to corner pencil line. My dashed line is just to the left, and there I go. So now I have my lines marked. This is a great way. You can see that I am accurate here, and then those seams are just what I need to sew on in order to create a slightly oversized half square triangle on each side that I will trim back. Number 3, sewing our lines. Okay, so I'm just going to review with you. We marked that corner to corner line. Then I placed my 1/4 inch marking of my ruler just to the left of that line, and I marked here, flipped it around, and marked here. Now it's time to sew those, and I sewed it in dark thread just so that you can see. We're going to sew the 2 lines, and then of course those will make our half square triangles. So just to review, we marked those 1/4 inch lines from our cutting line by placing the 1/4 inch marking of our ruler just to the left of the line, and then we drew those lines. Then we will sew right on those lines. So that was option 2. But now with number 3, option number 3 has to do with sewing. It's just like we did in option 2. We've marked the diagonal corner to corner line. We've marked our 1/4 inch sewing lines, a 1/4 inch away from each side of that. But when we go to sew it, we sew just to the inside of the diagonal lines, just to make sure that we have enough. We still have enough for a seam allowance here. It's shy of a 1/4 inch, but that's okay. What I don't like about this method is that you can see I got a little off track here. So again, totally personal preference. If you prefer to do it this way and sew just to the inside of the line, you can do that. If you prefer to use option number 2, you sew right on top of the line. Either way, you will create half square triangles that will give you a little extra that you can trim back. This is not as crucial as the trimming part is, the finished size of your half square triangle. Number 4. Press gently without distorting, especially when you're using a pressing solution. So here's my half square triangle before it's been trimmed. The first thing, we've cut it apart, and now I'm going to press it towards the darker fabric. Now without any pressing solution on my half square triangle, I would place my iron, hold it down, and pick it up. Now you can see it doesn't lay perfectly flat, but it's okay. This is why I like to use pressing solution, because I can flatten that out, but you have to be really careful because the accuracy of your half square triangle can be diminished just by your pressing technique. So what I did with this one is I took my pressing marker, which has pressing solution in it, and I painted right along that seam so that I had pressing solution concentrated on the seam, nowhere else. Then I take my iron and I just place it on the half square triangle, 10-15 seconds maybe, just until the pressing solution is dry. And look, I have this beautiful, flat, square, half square triangle with no distortion. Now, this particular piece, what I did was I sprayed it with my pressing solution. I painted it with my pressing marker, and then you can see the distortion is out of control here because I did this and I just moved it around to make sure that I had everything all pressed dry. But in the process, this block had a lot of pressing solution on it, so it was wet and it distorted as I was moving my iron to the point that this would not work. In fact, if I would try to line this up and cut, as you can see, it's so distorted, everything would be out of whack and I wouldn't be able to use it. You want to be really careful when you use a pressing solution that everything is pressed dry, but you don't move your iron and distort the piece in the process. Number 5. Square up every half square triangle. That doesn't just mean trim it, but we really want to square it up. We want to make sure that in the end, our half square triangle is square. So there are several ways that we can do this depending on the rulers that we use. And I'm just going to show you a few of my favorites. First is this particular ruler, the Clearly Perfect Slotted Trimmer. What you do with this ruler is you place the dashed line, looks like a sewing line, you place that on your half square triangle right on the sewn line. So that's what I've done here. And this is going to be, remember, we want this to be a 3.5 inch unfinished, 3 inch finished. And so I just basically cut here, I cut here, and then what's cool about this is it's got these little slots, which is why it's called the perfectly slotted trimmer, and you can trim off your dog ears right away. So you can go ahead and trim all of your half square triangles before you press them, and then put your pressing solution on, press it open, and you have that 3.5 inch half square triangle. The next one is just using your regular square ruler. And what you're going to do on that, you need to have your piece already pressed open. Then you'll line up the diagonal line. Remember, it needs to be 3.5 inches, so you want your 3.5 inch marking as well as the edges all underneath the ruler. And then you're going to trim here and here, flip it around, and trim the other 2 edges. You have to be careful when you do this because they can slip. So you want to make sure that you've got a good grip on it and that it doesn't get out of line when you're trimming the first 2 sides. But that's the second way. The third way is using a block lock ruler, which this is my favorite way. I find that I'm always accurate with this. With the Clearly Perfect slotted trimmer, I sometimes am not accurate just because I haven't lined things up exactly right. Where this has got a double check. I've got a groove on here that does not let this move. So for me, it's a little pricey, absolutely worth the price. You can see that I can trim my first 2 sides, and then I will flip this around, flip my ruler around, and trim my second 2 sides. It doesn't go anywhere as I'm trimming because it has this lip that hooks onto my seam allowance and keeps everything in place. This is my favorite. But maybe you don't want to spend the money for that. You can actually make your own block lock ruler, a ruler similar to the block lock. And what you do is you just stack up, I stacked 5 pieces of painter's tape on the wrong side of my ruler. I let it overhang. I just kept stacking it up, making sure that I was right along the diagonal line. Once I had them all stacked 5 high, I turned it over and I trimmed off the excess that was hanging off the edge. Then when I place it on my piece, it does the same thing. Look at that. It does not move. It's not lined up exactly like the block lock. The block lock gives me measurements on all sides. So you have to be a little careful and make sure that you know 1, 2, 3.5. And then we will trim. We want to make sure again that we've got a little extra showing on these sides. We'll trim the top 2 sides, flip it around, flip our ruler around, and then trim the other 2 sides. But this works really well. So those are the 4 options to square up our half square triangles. We want to make sure they are perfectly sized, and these are 4 different ways that we can do that. Number 6, you want to check your stitching consistency. You want to make sure that you have sewn a nice even stitch on here. And this can be an issue if your stitches are too wide. When you normally turn on a sewing machine, you get maybe a 2.2, 2.3, even a 2.4 stitch length. You really need about a 1.8 to a 1.9. As you can see, this is very tiny stitching. That way you go from point to point, so that when you even try to pull these apart, they don't pull apart. Where if you had a long stitch length, it's very easy for you to lose that end, and then that will make your, not only make your stitches come apart, but it'll pull your half square triangle apart. Sewing that together then, when you have pinned and you're going to sew along this edge, if it's not exactly right on both sides, you can have some distortion, seams pulling, and that's going to change the width actually of your piece once you've sewn these together. You want to make sure you have a consistent stitch length. Sometimes when we get started at the beginning here, our needle tends to chew up the fabric. One thing I like to do is I like to start on the less busy end. This one's busy, so I would rather come off this end rather than start here. So if I start here, I might want to send a piece of fabric in first. We call it a leader. Just a little piece of folded fabric that you place, you sew on that, and then it's easy to transition from this piece to your actual half square triangle. Continue on down and off the end. Number 7, you need to use the right thread weight when it comes to your piecing. Now, if you take a look at this, when you're making your half square triangles, what do we think about first of all? We want to match our thread. Usually we use a white, a gray, a black, depending on our project, that blends well. But we don't always think about is how heavy the thread is. Now, a heavier weight thread has a lower number. This is a 50 weight thread right here. This is usually what I use for piecing. This is actually a 60 weight. A 60 weight is thinner. It's hard to tell on here, and you would think, oh, what kind of a difference could that possibly make? But it does make a difference. Where does it make a difference? It makes a difference when we sew our pieces together and then we press to one side, because that thread takes up space underneath the fold right here. You wouldn't think it takes up a lot of space, but when we're talking about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, it can make a difference when we are pressing this, and it can actually take away from the total size of our half square triangle. If we have a heavy thread under here, it's going to pull that side of the half square triangle towards the center. When we have a lighter weight, we're able to flatten it out more, and you can see this is a nice flat seam. So thread weight is really important. You want to make sure that you actually match your thread weight all the way through your project. Usually our fabrics are about the same. They're 100% cotton. We use either a cotton or a polyester thread, and we make sure that everything matches. But sometimes we may have a flannel, we may have a wool, some other type of fabric that we are making our half square triangles, and that again is going to have that fold over that's going to actually take up a little more room, and we want to make sure that we still have cut accurately. That again is where those rulers come into place, where we make sure that we have cut an accurate half square triangle before we continue piecing this square into the rest of our block. Number 8, this is our final way to troubleshoot our half square triangles to make sure we have them accurate and ready to go when we put them into our block. And the way we do that is don't make a whole bunch, cut them all, and then realize when we start to square them up that we don't have the right size. Make a couple, double check. Then once you've double checked with the ones that you've made, go ahead and cut the rest. Have some test units. That is so important, and I'm going to show you why. In this particular example, I showed you all the different rulers that we use. The clearly slotted, the block lock, our homemade ruler, just a regular square ruler. And we think that it's going to come out right. Now, as I told you, when I use my block lock ruler, I know right off the bat that this is going to come out correct when I'm trimming it up. But what if I didn't have a large enough square to do that? What if I cut my first one wrong? What if I cut a 3.5 inch square instead of a 4 inch? That is super important that we do that test square first. If it's okay, then we can move on and finish up. Now, this one checked out just fine. I look at this, I've got plenty of space to trim around the edge, so I know that that actual line that I drew was good. I didn't draw it too far out. I have enough fabric on each side that there's enough left for trimming. This one is good. So I know with my block lock this will work. And it'll also work for the homemade block lock as well, and just my regular square ruler. This is where I've had an issue with my Clearly Perfect slotted trimmer. Not that it isn't a good ruler, it's a wonderful ruler and I love it. But unless you test it out, it is very easy to be off. Now look at this one, and I've got my line here, my 3.5 inch dashed line, and then if I go ahead and I trim everything off, I have my dashed line right on top of the sewn line. So it's right on top of it. I can see my sewn line, and now I'm going to go ahead. I want to make sure it's centered. You can see it's centered up here. And I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. This is going to be my test square because I want to make sure with the thread that I've used, with the way that I've cut everything, that once I go ahead and cut this, I'm still going to have a 3.5 inch finished square. If I don't, that means I need to move this either down or up, depending on the finished size that I'm going to check right now. So I've got this, I'm going to press it towards my red fabric. Okay, now remember, I put it right on the line. Now I'm going to check with my ruler and see how I did. So let's check. This is my 3.5 inch. I'm going to place this right on here, and look, it looks pretty good. So I know that with what I had when I placed my dashed line right on top of that sewn line, centered it with the tip, I can go ahead and do that with the rest because I know it's going to work. I know where the positioning is based on the fabric I'm using and the thread I'm using. So important that you give it a test run before you go ahead and cut everything and cut them all wrong. And there you have it. 8 ways to troubleshoot your half square triangles and keep them from coming up short. With these simple adjustments, you will get perfect half square triangles every single time. Let me know in the comments which tip helped you the most. And if you found this helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with your fellow quilters. Thank you for joining me. I am always trying to be joyful, but I will always be merry.